synapse is the place that connects two different neurons.
Can you hear
from
the
the
voice
end
of
one
this video?
Yes.
Okay.
neuron axon to the dendrite of another neuron. The synapse is responsible for passing on signals between a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. The axon terminal is filled with vesicles containing neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin, just to mention a few. These neurotransmitters are used to stimulate the postsynaptic neuron. On these synaptic vesicles are small proteins called snare proteins.
Okay, forget about the protein. Okay, هو هون عم بقول لكم إنه قبل ما ينفتحوا هول الفيسيكلز بيجي بروتين اسمه سنير بيلزق عليهم بقربهم على الممبرين وبيفتح. بس شو بدكم فيه؟
And they bind to other snare proteins on the cell membrane. When the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron receives an electrical signal from an action potential, it causes calcium channels to open, letting in positive ions. Calcium will bind to the proteins and cause them to pull the vesicles closer to the phospholipid bilayer membrane, where the vesicles will fuse with the membrane and cause an exocytosis. The vesicles then will
لما يفتحوا يمس هول الفيسيكلز وبيمرق النيوروترانسميتر from البريسينابتيك على البوست-سينابتيك اوكي بنسميها exocytosis.
the neurotransmitters out into the space between the two neurons, called the synaptic cleft. Here the neurotransmitters will bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. These receptors are associated with special ion channels, such as the sodium channel. When the ion channels open, they allow positive sodium ions to enter the cell. This will cause the environment inside the neuron to depolarize, where the electrical charge on the intracellular space will become more positive, and the electrical charge outside the neuron will become less positive. If the electrical change is big enough, it will create an actual potential, and the signal will continue.
Do you understand, miss? It was clear?
هدول information جداد اللي انت قلتيهم
تبع البروتين. No, no, just عن البروتين لا.
اوكي.
بدكم نعيده ولا بكفي على next video؟ ريان كنت بآخره يعني وصلتي على الأخير، بدك أعطيك إياه هو 2 minutes بس.
إذا مش رح تبعتيه إيه بليز.
هلا أنا رح أبعته.
أوكي لكن برجع بشوفه.
So next video. next video طويل شوي. هيدا 7 minutes تقريبا. just focus على الانفورميشن اللي أنا عطيتكم إياه، أوكي؟
Hi, this is Peter from Anatomy Zone, and in this Neuroanatomy Basics tutorial we're going to take a look at the structure of the synapse. There are two types of junctions between neurons. You've got chemical synapses and then you've got electrical synapses. In this tutorial we're going to take a look at the chemical synapse. So in a chemical synapse you've got a substance called neurotransmitter which is released from the presynaptic neuron and diffuses across a small gap to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. An electrical synapse, on the other hand, actually has a direct connection between the two cells, and this direct connection is called the gap junction. Examples of the electrical synapse.
هون مس في عندي synaptic cleft بيعطي neurotransmitter لتمرق على تاني ميلة، بينما electrical synapse بيكون في عندي direct contact يعني بيكونوا موصولين مع بعض تقريبا يعني هون السبيس جدا جدا قليل فبسموها gap junction.
Found in cardiac muscle and also in smooth muscle. And the purpose of the electrical gap junction in cardiac muscle is that you get extremely fast conduction. So you can imagine in
The difference
a
between
beating
chemical
heart,
and electrical أسرع بكتير من chemical سريع بس even electrical is more fast. And we can find this kind of synapse in cardiac muscle and smooth muscle.
you need extremely fast and synchronized conduction so that the contraction of the heart is coordinated. So you've got this direct coupling from one cell to the other in an electrical synapse. So what you can see here is the axon endings of one neuron connecting with the dendrites of another neuron. So we're going to take a look at the structure of the chemical synapse. Now what we're looking at here is the axon of one neuron, and then it's coming down to form this terminal bouton, this synaptic terminal. You've got this little gap between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron here, and this little gap is called the synaptic cleft. This membrane here is the postsynaptic membrane, and this membrane here is the presynaptic membrane. So let's take a look at what happens at this junction. Within this synaptic bouton, you've also got these vesicles, which are membrane-bound structures which contain the neurotransmitter, so the chemical which will bind to the postsynaptic receptors. So how does the chemical within these vesicles act? Well, this is all due to the impulse that is transmitted down the axon. So an action potential arrives in the synaptic bouton from the axon, and when this happens, you get an influx of calcium from the extracellular space into the presynaptic nerve end. So when this action potential comes down the axon, the term change in voltage membrane actually causes these calcium channels to open and allow calcium into the presynaptic ending. So the type of channel is called a volgated channel because it's dependent on the voltage across the membrane. What happens when the calcium enters the presynaptic ending is that the vesicles dock and fuse to the presynaptic membrane. The next thing that happens is a process called exocytosis. This is the process by which the vesicles fuse to the presynaptic membrane and then release their contents into the synaptic cleft. The next thing that happens
على الدفتر. Okay, when the neurotransmitter من البريسينابتيك اكتبوا exocytosis. يعني هذا الفينومينا اللي عم بيصير.
is that the neurotransmitter diffuses this short distance across the cleft, and it then binds to these receptors which you can see embedded in the postsynaptic membrane. The ion channel within the receptor can then open up and allow ions from the extracellular fluid to enter the postsynaptic neuron. This change in ion concentration can then potentially lead to the generation of another action potential which can propagate down this postsynaptic neuron. The final step of this process is neurotransmitter elimination or reuptake into the presynaptic terminal. So to illustrate this whole process with a specific example, we could take a look at the neuromuscular junction.
So first he was talking in general السينابس كيف بيشتغل. Okay, هلا عم يعطي example.
This is where the nervous system is in contact with the muscles. In this particular example, the neuron, the presynaptic neuron, would be a motor neuron, and the postsynaptic neuron isn't actually a neuron, it would be
so
the
first
muscle
كمان
cell.
كان عم يحكي neuron مع neuron, but now neuron with muscle. Okay?
So the process is the same in that an action potential arrives into the synaptic bouton, you get calcium influx, and you get fusion of the vesicles to the presynaptic membrane. Within the vesicles, you would have acetylcholine. So in the case of neuromuscular transmission, the neurotransmitter in question is called acetylcholine. You then get fusion of these acetylcholine
So هون
containing vesicles to
عطاني
the
between neuron and muscle النيوروترانسميتر اللي عم يحكي لي عنه صار اسمه acetylcholine.
presynaptic membrane potential to be generated and for another signal to pass down the postsynaptic neuron. So that's a brief look at the structures of the synapse and the basis of transmission from one neuron to the next. If you have found this video helpful, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and make sure you check out some more of our videos.
Is it clear, miss? حبيتون هول التيوز؟
يا مس بس شو اسم هذا البروسيس اللي بين لما يطلع
exocytosis.
exocytosis.
exo يعني جاي من external انه عم يظهر، وسيتوسس هو على السيتوبلازم يعني للفراغ على الكلافت. و then we have سيس يعني كأنه تقطيع. اوكي
بس
انتوا
هذه
ايه قل لي.
هذه لما بتمشي المسج يعني من السينابس للسينابس
مسج. لا هيدا البروسيس بيصير فيها انه النيورو ترانسميتر بيمرق بقلب السينابتيك كلافت من البوست للبري سينابتيك، من البري للبوست سينابتيك.
اوكي ماشي.
بس هيدا الكولين هو الكيميكال سبستانس ولا شو هو؟
اسيتيل كولين. يس
اللي بيكون بقلب النيورو ترانسميتر.
بيكون لا هو النيورو ترانسميتر بيكون بقلب الفيسيكال. اوكي بدكم عدل. هلا في هون واحد بعد
يعني هو
this فيديو. ها هيدا وقته شي 7 minutes.
يعني هو السبب
قد ايه بعد معنا
بيكون
وقت؟
بقلب النيرو.
يس مس
5 minutes.
معنا 5 minutes.
ايه فاطمة ما سمعتك. فاطمة
هيدا اللي كنتوا عم تحكوا عنه، يعني هو سبستانس موجودة بقلب النيرو ترانسميتر.
yes this one هيدا لونه in red. اوكي هيدا النيورو ترانسميتر اللي اسمه اسيتيل كولين. بيعطاني اياه بالسكند فيديو. اوكي هيدا انه الفيسيكال تقرب وتفتح وترمي هول النيورو ترانسميتر اللي هن اسمهم اسيتيل كولين بالحاله لما يكون between neuron and muscle بنسميها اكزوسايتوس. هول هن بيعلقوا على الريسبتور بيفتحوا الشانلز وبيمرقوا.
اوكي
يس وليد.
يا بس هي دايما بتكون اكتل كولين بالمصل.
yes acetylcholine هو kind of neurotransmitters. yes
يعني ممكن يتغير مش دايما بيكون اكتل كولين.
ايه لا ما هو قبل بالفيديو اللي قبل عدلك 3 قال لك you have millions of neurotransmitters. في عنا كتير منهم. اوكي بس عدلك سيروتونين وعدلك الدوبامين وعدلك الاسيتيلكولين. في عندك كتير يعني إذا بتشوف أسامي على جوجل بالهبل. سو حطلك الأكتر شيء بحطوهم بالكتب. في جابا أنا حاطط لكم كذا واحد بالسلايد اللي في مرق سلايد حاطط لكم few names of these neurotransmitters. اوكي وقت كنت عم بعطي difference between inhibitor وال excitatory synapse. اوكي هلا بعد في شي 3 دقايق ما بعرف اذا انا I'm not lucky today لانه الكمبيوتر شوي عم بيعذبني I think لانه فول فاصلا في قصص انمحت من عندي. اوكي انا ما رح كمله على الاخير بس لما يخلص الوقت على 40 minutes تقريبا بوقف. اعمل لكم شير.
بكرة بدنا نبلش بجريد 11.
اذا مش بكره في بعد فيديو ما بعرف اذا بحضر لكم اياه بس تقريبا ايه. Yes.
And you're tuned in to neurotransmissions. In our last few episodes, we talked about resting potentials and action potentials, the language used by neurons to communicate their signals from one end of the cell to the other. But how does that message get passed from one neuron to the next?
Yeah.
Each neuron is separated from its neighbors. How do they do it? Now I get to talk about my favorite part of the neuron, the synapse. Before we go on, if you haven't already, you may want to brush up on the anatomy of the neuron with this video. And you might also want to watch the videos about resting and action potentials. As we discussed last week, your neurons use ions and electrical potential differences to transmit signals from one end to the other. As that signal reaches the end of the axon, it comes to a structure called the synaptic terminal. This structure has several parts. The side of the cell sending the signal is called the presynaptic terminal. The gap in the middle is called the synaptic cleft. And finally, on the other cell receiving the signal is the postsynaptic terminal. There are two basic categories of synapses: gap junction and the chemical synapse. The electrical synapse
انتوا سامعين من الاول؟
عم بقطش صوتك أصلاً.
لا الصوت طالع بس كان عم
simple of
بقطش.
the two, allowing direct ionic current between cells, as the action potential across the synaptic cleft. These types of synapses have very little space between the pre- and postsynaptic terminals, about 3 nanometers, and use specialized proteins called connexins to form channels that allow the ionic current to pass between cells. It's sort of like a skywalk between 2 buildings. There are still 2 distinct buildings, but it's easy to send a message across the next building because you can
about
just cross the bridge.
electric,
Because
okay?
is so small, electrical synapses allow cells to respond very quickly to signals, and the cells connected tend to react together. Because of this, they're important for tasks that require very fast signaling, intensive reflexes in animals. The other type of synapse, the chemical synapse, is wider and more complex with slower signaling. In these synapses, to 50 nanometers wide. It's pretty, but a lot bigger than gap junction. Because of this, using ions to directly signal onto the next cell isn't practical. There is no sky bridges connecting these 2 buildings. Instead, chemical synapses came up with a different way to send their messages. Remember the presynaptic terminal? Let's think of it as a cellular post office. In the presynaptic terminal, you can find these itty-bitty spherical structures called vesicles. Think of them like envelopes. These vesicles are little pockets of membrane that hold the information to be transmitted, keeping the message contained until the post office of the synapse is told to release the information. Inside each vesicle are chemicals known as neurotransmitters. Quite literally, these molecules transmit information
Okay, I'm going
between
to stop
neurons.
here. Okay,
These are
next
like the
time برجع بعت لكم إياه we will continue tomorrow, okay? لأنه بلشوا next session يفوتوا هلا. Okay, ماس؟
اوكي ميس يعطيك العافية.
Okay, bye bye.
اوكي ميس.